Congressman Chief Deputy Whip Guy Reschenthaler joins me. Good evening, sir.
Greta, good afternoon. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so what happened behind closed doors today? Did you get some agreement? Is there any budging on the Republican side of the aisle to raise that debt ceiling so that we don't go into default?
Greta, we're going to get to 218 votes to raise the debt ceiling, but we're going to do it in a reasonable, responsible, and sensible way. We cannot continue to increase the debt limit unless we have some reforms. We've got to do three things with this debt limit. Number one is we have to limit our future spending. Two, we've got to make sure we save the taxpayers' money. And finally, we've got to grow the economy. So the framework that we're working on does all three of those things. In terms of limiting spending.
Suppose the president doesn't agree. Suppose President Biden just says no. And then what?
Well, we have to remember two things to that point, Greta. Joe Biden has already voted 3 or 4 times on a debt ceiling to raise the debt ceiling with Medicaid work requirements, for example, with savings reforms. He's on record saying previously he wouldn't vote to increase the debt ceiling unless there were reforms to spending. So the Joe Biden that was in the Senate was much more similarly positioned to wanting to have tax savings and limits on spending to raise the debt ceiling. Number two, passing a clean debt ceiling, it's not going to happen because Schumer doesn't have the votes for it in the Senate. If Schumer thought he could pass a clean debt ceiling, he should pass it out of the Senate, and then we can deal with it in the House. But it's not going to happen. There's no appetite for that in the Senate, and there's no votes to do a clean debt ceiling here in the House. We need to be reasonable, responsible, and sensible, raise the debt ceiling, but have an eye toward future spending to make sure that we limit, save, and grow. And that's what we're going to do with the framework we're putting together.
All right. When was the last time the House GOP leadership spoke to President Biden about this debt ceiling?
Joe Biden is not negotiating. It was weeks ago that he and Speaker McCarthy spoke, but it's going to be irrelevant once we put a product in the Senate. Once Kevin McCarthy gets a framework passed, which I think that we're closing in on that in the next few weeks, and Chuck Schumer has to deal with it, then Biden will be forced to negotiate. The fact that Biden is refusing to come to the table, that's what's irresponsible here, Greta. The responsible, sensible, and reasonable thing to do is what we're doing, putting together this framework that looks long-term, raises the debt ceiling so we're not defaulting, we're not losing our reserve currency status, for example. That would be disastrous, but puts us on a path to have fiscal responsibility. That's the key.
Well, you mentioned the reserve currency status. I mean, that's a huge thing because you just had President Macron in China with President Xi, and it sure sounded like they want to move away from the dollar, and which, of course, if they move away from the dollar, reduces our influence dramatically globally, and it also makes it all our sanctions ineffective to achieve the goals that we set out to achieve with them.
Exactly. You can't overstate, Greta, the catastrophe that would be the U.S. losing our reserve currency status. And we take this for granted, much like the Brits, by the way, took them being the reserve currency up until the end of World War II. They took it for granted. And we're seeing this come apart. And if it comes apart, think about it. Right now, until very recently, the Saudis would only sell petroleum in U.S. dollars. So in a lot of sense, we had a lot of sway with petroleum prices. Now that they're selling it in Chinese yen, that's problematic. You might see a split and regionalization where you have, for example, the Swiss franc, the Saudi riyal, the Chinese yen. That would really hurt our ability to have dollar diplomacy. It would hurt our ability to sanction adversaries, for example, and it would really limit our ability to set the value of the U.S. dollar. So it would be catastrophic to us, not only domestically, but also internationally.
We only have 30 seconds left, but I must say I'm shocked at President Macron because and what he did going over to China, basically talking about the currency reserve and also the comments he made about the U.S. I think that's a real wake up notice for us.
Well, it's because of Biden's weakness. If America led from the front like we were doing with the former administration, like President Trump, our allies would have faith in us. But this President Biden, he abandoned Afghanistan, left our allies there on the ground. He vacillated with Ukraine with misstatements early in the war saying that we would tolerate a minor incursion. and he likes to play it soft with China as they're looking at taking Taiwan. So it's American weakness that's leading to the vacillation from our European allies and our other allies across the world. We need to put America back in a leadership position, and we need to lead from the front and project power forward on the international stage. That's how we resolve this situation.
Congressman Guy Reschenthaler, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Greta.